evening. There you are. It's great to see you all coming in. Man, the West Coast is in the house and then Oklahoma City. And I know I've got a couple, I think one at least I saw out in California. I think a couple in Virginia, kind of all over the place. This is wonderful as always. My favorite night of the week in the online world with you all. So grateful for your presence and for being here tonight to join us for these next couple of chapters in essence. And I do need to go ahead and say this, that I posted, it was quite a few weeks ago, I posted the actual kind of breakdown of where we were going. And I actually realized I posted an earlier version of what I'm planning on doing. And up to this week, it's been exactly on the exact books and the rest. So I'm actually going to go back and edit that, but I'll then repost. So if you are reading ahead and the rest, you can kind of know where we're going on that from that standpoint. But everything up to this point has been where we're at. So I'm so grateful that you're here, so grateful for your presence, for your tuning in from all over the United States, and for those who are tuning in after all over the world. Really is, I'm really enjoying this, really enjoying going through this book over and over again. I think at this point in time, I've actually read through the book probably 8 or 9 times, give or take. But every time there's just something a little bit more that I catch, something more that I want to share. And in some ways, I think that's why at the end of the last couple of weeks, we're going to be recapping some things going back, because there's just so much more to go back and catch that I wasn't able to get the first time. Great to see you, Judy, all the way from Dalton, Georgia. So now we've got the East Coast coming in. Obviously, I'm in the Midwest, so we've got all the coasts covered. This is fantastic. And we've also got that central part of America with David Clevenger there in Oklahoma. Really appreciate all of you guys tuning in. With that in mind, we are just going to dive in. We've got a lot to cover tonight, so we're going to dive right into the study. I hope you've got your book, and if not, as you've noticed these last couple of weeks, I really am trying to provide as much as I can, the slides to read along together. So here we go. In and of itself, as we continue kind of this study of Mere Christianity, I do want to just kind of remind us again of the time and the place of when this is happening. Because when you actually stop for a second and think back, it's easy for us just to read this book in our 21st century mindset in the year 2023 and miss out on the reality of what was going on in 1942, 1943, especially in Europe, and where he was at the time at the University of Oxford, having fought in World War I. This is a man who had seen combat action, and now here he is, a professor, a theologian, but he doesn't really see himself nearly as much as a theologian. He's a practical Christian in a lot of ways. That's the way he kind of views himself. He is a professor. He's a very well-learned man, but the times in which they're in were very different. They were tough. They were hard. And so some of the analogies and the way that he writes in this book can be missed if we just kind of think like, well, that's an odd kind of correlation that he would put there, or that's a weird way of putting that. Even the premise of an invasion, as we've looked at in previous weeks, and I told you all I love the idea of us being in a rebellion against Satan and what he's doing. All of those terminologies, this war terminologies, were because it was a live radio address to people who very much understood the premise of war years. And I'll just throw this out there. We didn't do well as a people, even just as a lockdown, when we could have food delivered to our houses. We can have these moments, right, where we can really be honest that we didn't really handle that as well as we could have. And here you have nightly bombardments and air raid sirens and your loved ones going off to war and searching the papers to see if your loved ones were killed. This was a tough time. And so to read these and to hear these and to listen to this type of terminology would have been very relevant, would have been extremely relevant to them in their time. And so I just kind of want to lay that before you as we dive into some of the terminologies he's about to use. So we're going to start off with chapter 1, the 3 parts of morality. This is book 3, chapter 1, and you see book 3 has quite a few chapters, and so we'll go through these over time. Tonight, I'm actually just going to do the first 2, because as I was going through this, originally I'd planned on doing 3, but as I got through that, I was like, it's just so much stuff, not enough time to cover all 3 chapters, so we're just going to do the first 2 chapters tonight. And he starts off and says this: And I'm afraid that it is the sort of idea that the word morality raises in a good many people's minds, something that interferes, something that stops you having a good time. In reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. So if you think back, he's referencing this premise of morality, of speaking for once of this word, and he actually kind of starts off by noting this idea that it almost feels like a child going, well, morality is just basically God telling me telling me I can't do all the fun stuff. I can't do all the stuff that I really want to do. And he's saying, and I'm afraid that that's the sort of idea that the word morality raises in a good many people's minds. Something that interferes, but that's not really what it is. In reality, moral rules are directions for running the human machine. So what does that look like? Some people prefer to talk about moral ideals rather than moral rules, and about more idealism rather than moral obedience. Now, it is, of course, quite true that moral perfection is an ideal in the sense that we cannot achieve it. In that sense, every kind of perfection is, for us humans, an ideal. We cannot succeed in being perfect car drivers or perfect tennis players or in drawing perfectly straight lines. So that is an ideal. That is something that we cannot arrive to. But there is another sense in which it is very misleading to call moral perfection an ideal. When a man says that a certain woman or house or shop or garden is his ideal, he does not mean, unless he is rather a fool, that everyone else ought to have the same ideal. Now, you just think about that of your own spouse, your loved ones, and the rest, that the idea of there being a standard, a perfect ideal, we all have different tastes and likes and so forth. In fact, he says in such matters we are entitled to have different tastes and therefore different ideals. But it is dangerous to describe a man who tries very hard to keep the moral law as a man of high ideals, because this might lead you to think that moral perfection was a private taste of his own, and that the rest of us were not called in to share in. Now, this is an interesting notion that he's kind of laying forth here, that we have to be careful of not saying that there's this moral ideal that everybody needs to get to, because then it kind of ascribes, well, who gets to decide that moral ideal? Do I get to do that? Well, I'm not really sure I would agree with your moral ideals in that premise. And so he's saying that's not the case here. In the same way, every moral failure is going to cause trouble, probably to others and certainly to yourself. By talking about rules and obedience instead of ideals and idealism, we help to remind ourselves of these facts. That's why rules and obedience, and he talks about this premise of a machine, in essence, that these rules are set there to how to make the machine run better, how to make it run right. And instead of it just being kind of this, well, let's try this and see if ideally it would work like this. But instead it's, no, this is how we know that it's supposed to work. These rules and obeying those rules helps us to remind ourselves of what would ultimately be best for us. There are two ways in which the human machine goes wrong. One is when human individuals drift apart from one another or else collide with one another and do one another damage by cheating or bullying. The other is when things go wrong inside the individual, when the different parts of him, his different faculties and desires and so on, either drift apart or interfere with one another. So this is a fantastic little notion, because he's kind of just talking about like the human machine and how we work, and now he's going to kind of go into more of a military type discussion. You can get the idea plain if you think of us as a fleet of ships sailing in formation. The voyage will be a success only, in the first place, if the ships do not collide and get in one another's way. That seems fairly evident. And secondly, if each ship is seaworthy and has her engines in good order. As a matter of fact, you cannot have either of these two things without the other. If the ships keep on having collisions, they will not remain seaworthy very long. On the other hand, if their steering gears are out of order, they will not be able to avoid collisions. So this seems like a very easy thing. And I go back to, you think of the blockades and all the different things that were going on in World War II, especially between France and England and the rest. This imagery is very relevant to his times. But there is one thing that we have not yet taken into account. We have not asked where the fleet is trying to get to, or what piece of music the band is trying to play. So right before this, he also kind of denotes this idea of playing a tune. Like every instrument individually has to play a certain way, but also what is the tune? They also have to come together and not run over each other or one be louder than the other. The instruments might be all in tune and might all come in at the right moment. But even so, the performance would not be a success if they had been engaged to provide dance music and actually played nothing but dead marches. And however well the fleet sailed, its voyage would be a failure if it were meant to reach New York and actually arrived in Calcutta. Now, this is a fascinating little way he's playing around with this idea of, even if these things are right, even if you've got your ships going in the right direction, the band all playing the right thing, if their overall point, if their overall goal or their direction is not correct, then it doesn't matter even in those moments if they've got those other two things correct. Morality, then, seems to be concerned with three things. Firstly, with fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, with what might be called tidying up or harmonizing the things inside each individual. Thirdly, with the general purpose of human life as a whole, what man was made for, what course the whole fleet ought to be on, and what tune the conductor of the band wants it to play. You may have noticed that modern people are nearly always thinking about the first thing and forgetting the other two. When people say in the newspapers that we are striving for Christian moral standards, they usually mean that we are striving for kindness and fair play between nations and classes and individuals. That is, they are thinking only of the first thing. And man, if you think of our current culture right now, this is unbelievably true. Even to this day, when people talk about morality, they're almost always just referencing the concept of fairness, of being fair, of how we do and how we treat others and so forth. It's very much just kind of the basic premise of it. When a man says about something he wants to do, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else harm. Now think about that just for a second in our modern culture. The concept of privacy, that I can do whatever I want with my own body and so forth. I can do whatever I might want with my own self. It's not hurting anybody, and because it doesn't hurt anybody, it's not wrong. That's the mentality. So when a man says about something he wants to do, it can't be wrong because it doesn't do anyone else harm, he is thinking only of the first thing. He is thinking it does not matter what his ship is like inside, provided that he does not run into the next ship. And it is quite natural when we start thinking about morality to begin with the first thing, with social relations. As long as I'm not hurting somebody else, then it can't be morally wrong. Correct? That's kind of the premise. For one thing, the results of bad morality in that sphere are so obvious and press on us every day. War and poverty and graft and lies and shoddy work. So he's saying, look, there's a lot of things that can go wrong in these scenarios, especially since if you just do what you think is best, and as long as it doesn't hurt others, that's not automatically how others are going to think. And also, as long as you stick to the first thing, there is very little disagreement about morality. As long as if you say it doesn't hurt anybody else, it's only for me, then everybody else agrees with it. Almost all people at all times have agreed in theory that human beings ought to be honest and kind and helpful to one another. But though it is natural to begin with all that, if our thinking about morality stops there, we might just as well not have thought at all, unless we go on to the second thing, the tidying up inside each human being. We are only deceiving ourselves. And I love where he goes with this here. What is the good of telling the ships how to steer so as to avoid collision if, in fact, they are such crazy old tubs that they cannot be steered at all? What is the good of drawing up on paper rules for social behavior if we know that, in fact, our greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit are going to prevent us from keeping them? I do not mean for a moment that we ought not to think and think hard about improvements in our social and economic system. What I do mean is that all of that thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. So now he's talking more from a, not necessarily political, but more of a global sense of things. So if you only worry about, as long as it doesn't hurt someone else, you're assuming that everybody is actually going to agree with that, and that the actions of individuals will not ultimately fall into what almost always happens, which is greed, cowardice, ill temper, and self-conceit will rule their little heads of those individuals. And so just the idea that it will keep to ourselves is illogical. Because of course not. Throughout history, we've seen that selfishness and self-conceit and greed and cowardice will rule in the individuals. They will step forward. And so this idea of, if we just stop and say, well, as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else, of course it will ultimately hurt someone else, because you've stopped too early in the process. And as he noted, what I do mean is that all the thinking will be mere moonshine unless we realize that nothing but the courage and unselfishness of individuals is ever going to make any system work properly. And he's referencing not just us, but the world itself. That if the world is filled with people who only think of themselves, everything will ultimately fail consistently. But I do not think we can stop there either. We are now getting to the point at which different beliefs about the universe lead to different behavior. Now, especially in our modern world, this is even more so. And it would seem at first sight very sensible to stop before we got there and just carry on with those parts of morality that all sensible people agree with. But can we? Remember that religion involves a series of statements about facts which must be either true or false. If they are true, one set of conclusions will follow about the right sailing of the human fleet. If they are false, quite a different set. For example, let us go back to the man who says that a thing cannot be wrong unless it hurts some other human being. He quite understands that he must not damage the other ships of the convoy, but he honestly thinks that what he does to his own ship is simply his own business. But does it not make a great difference whether his ship is his own property or not? Does it not make a great difference whether I am, so to speak, the landlord of my own mind and body, or only a tenant responsible to the real landlord? If somebody else made me for his own purposes, then I shall have a lot of duties which I should not have if I simply belong to myself. So here he's saying, look, just if you think you can make your own decisions about yourself, you're missing out on the fact that God is the one who made you, and there is a purpose there, and there is a reason, which means you are not your own, which means it's not your ship to do with whatever you please. Again, Christianity asserts that every individual human being is going to live forever, and this must be either true or false. Now, this is an interesting notion that I want to throw out there, and you can add your comments if you would like in this moment here. The idea of living forever, this is not something that you hear a lot. A lot of people love the idea of living forever when it comes to heaven. Very few people are a real big deal on the concept of living forever if you're in hell. In fact, we seem to be very, very excited about the idea that hell might be something temporary as opposed to eternal, the way that it's described in Scripture. Same thing with heaven. And when it comes down to it, the idea that we are made eternal, that we are eternal beings, is where we will spend eternity. That ultimately makes a big difference. In fact, he's going to get even more into this here in a second. Now, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Now, this is a fascinating notion, especially if you do believe in the concept of eternal life, or if you do believe in God, and if God is real, then guess what? Then, man, this little insight right here. Now, there are a good many things which would not be worth bothering about if I were going to live only 70 years. Temporary pleasures, temporary things that will fall away, the small fleeting things, but which I had better bother about very seriously if I'm going to live forever. Where I live forever, that question itself, the eternal nature of my soul, in essence of where I'm going to live, is a huge aspect of what I need to be thinking upon. And immortality makes this other difference, which, by the by, has a connection with the difference between totalitarianism and democracy. If individuals live only 70 years, then a state or a nation or a civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. So I want you to just catch this real quick. Because at the time they're talking about the raising up of, you have the Nazi Party, you have Germany itself, you have the British nation and so forth, you have all of this, there's war going on and the rest. And he's basically saying if individuals were to only live 70 years, they're finite, there is no God, there is nothing beyond this, then a state or a nation or a civilization, which may last for 1,000 years, is more important than an individual. But if Christianity is true, then the individual is not only more important, but incomparably more important, for he is everlasting, and the life of a state or a civilization compared with his is only a moment. And so he's saying this idea of you must sacrifice the individual for the state, he's saying, that's a dangerous premise, because the other side of it is, if the human soul is eternal, then the state in and of itself, or even the world we live in, the Roman Empire lasting 1,500 years, even the longest empires in the world, are nothing in comparison to the eternal soul. To lose your soul over the state would be a terrible thing to do. It seems then that if we were to think about morality, we must think of all three departments: relations between man and man, things inside each man, and relations between man and the power that made him. We can all cooperate in the first one, relations between man and man. Disagreements begin with the second and become more serious with the third. It is dealing with the third that the main differences between Christian and non-Christian morality come out. So this is a fascinating insight as he goes forward into this book. I really do love how this starts to play itself out, this idea of morality between man and man, how we treat one another, morality, and then the things inside of a man, what one must change or do or become or is, in essence. And you think of our common culture right now when it comes to identity, what you identify as, so and so forth. I mean, this is a battle of epic and historical proportions, not just happening now, but it's been happening for a long long time. And then I love that this last little part, disagreements begin with the second and become more serious with the third. He's dealing with the third, that the main difference between Christian and non-Christian morality come about. And David said, it almost seems like the removal of God allows certain political ideologies to replace the void and thus control us. Behemoth in action. Absolutely. Without a doubt. Especially when we all replace God with our own premise. And in reality, we're living out our understanding of morality, our moral standards, which goes back to the things inside each man, as opposed to the relationship between man and relationship between man and the power that made him. So, chapter 2, this is where we get into the cardinal virtues. According to this longer scheme, there are 7 virtues. Now, I should note I've skipped a little bit at the beginning here because he actually says, in my original speech, I didn't have time to expand on these, but now I do, so here I go. And so he kind of lays these things out, but I really do love this chapter and all that it entails. So, according to this longer scheme, there are 7 virtues. 4 of them are called cardinal virtues, and the remaining 3 are called theological virtues. The cardinal ones are those which our civilized people recognize. Which all civilized people recognize. The theological are those which, as a rule, only Christians know about. The word cardinal has nothing to do with cardinals in the Roman Church. It comes from a Latin word meaning the hinge of a door. These were called cardinal virtues because they are, as we would say, pivotal. And so David adds, the reason being that obviously states last longer than us and are more important than the most important since there is no God. Exactly. Which is why you have some of the larger nations like the USSR, China today, and a lot of others that are considered agnostic or atheistic at best cultures. The state is always more important than the individual because the state is seen as eternal or at least longer in its nature than the actual individual person is. So these cardinal virtues are cardinal because they are pivotal, literally like a hinge on a door. They help pivot things and ideas. Prudence means practical common sense, taking the trouble to think out what you are doing and what is likely to come of it. So this is the first one of these 4 cardinal virtues. It's prudence. Nowadays, most people hardly think of prudence as one of the virtues. In fact, because Christ said we could all get into his world by being like children, many Christians have the idea that, provided you are good, it does not matter being a fool. But that is a misunderstanding. Now, I do love this because we're going to get into something here in a second. In the first place, most children show plenty of prudence about doing the things they are really interested in and think them out quite sensibly. In the second place, as St. Paul points out, Christ never meant that we were to remain children in intelligence. On the contrary, he wants us to be simple, single-minded, affectionate, and teachable, as good children are. But he also wants every bit of intelligence we have to be alert at its job and in first-class fighting trim. The fact that you are giving money to a charity does not mean that you need not try to find out whether that charity is a fraud or not. Now, let me tell you how this plays itself in our world. And I know Jovan and others, and David, especially Clevenger, you would understand this. We at times, even within the church, have a tendency to find ourselves in kind of 2 camps. One of the camps that has grown in prevalence over the last 70 years or so, 50 to 70 years, has been what is often referred to as anti-intellectualism. That this idea of just give me the simplicity of the Bible and the rest. I don't need anything else. I don't need to study anything else. I need to do anything else in the rest. Now, there is an aspect where I can make this claim. Studying the Bible will always grant me the most that I can learn. It will grant me the beauty of my salvation and my understanding of God's word. There is wisdom to be found in places that you will not find in other things, without a doubt. And I can also say my salvation and what I learn about Jesus and the rest is found within the pages of Scripture. I know that. I know those things. But it doesn't take away what God has given me, my mind, to be able to use to his glory. In fact, this is what Lewis will get into. It is, of course, quite true that God will not love you any less or have any less use for you if you happen to have been born with a very second-rate brain. Now, this is a fascinating thing because you also understand he was a professor at one of the top schools in the world still to this day. He has room for people with very little sense, but he wants everyone to use what sense they have. The anti-intellectual movement has moved us to a point where both whether it's preachers, teachers, missionaries, and the rest, you have the 2 camps. One is like, you need more training, you need more education, you need more all of this. And yes, you need to study everything. Then the other camp is, you don't need to study anything except for the Bible. In fact, you're actually going to, I've heard it said before, you will study yourself right out of the church. I've heard that many times from people. And if y'all would bear with me for a second, I'll note this. when I first started attending at Harvard University, I got a lot of messages from some well-intentioned brothers who sent me well-intentioned messages, directly worried about my soul merely because of where I was attending school. And in some ways, like I said, well-intentioned. I don't want to negate that and the rest. But I do want to note that it implies a couple of things. One, that my faith is so unsound when it comes to it that I could be easily swayed just by those with high up degrees. And the second part of it was that simply attending or participating in these things would be too much for someone in the church. And it's almost this acceptance of, well, they'll have their high and mighty learning, but we Christians, we're simple people. We don't really need that. I would heavily and mightily disagree with that. In fact, I am a big encouragement of we need people of sound faith in all aspects, in all areas of academia and science and the rest, because I believe God works through many of these different areas where we can be witnesses to God's glory and to the story of God shared in life in these places. I love my alma mater, Freed-Hardeman University. In fact, it gave me the foundation for my faith. And the other side of it, Harvard gave me what it looks like to put something through the fire, the refining fires of being challenged on everything that I believed. And I don't mean that as a negative. I mean that as a good thing. It caused me to truly and deeply study not only the Word of God, but also the arguments of man so that I could better respond when people might have questions. Cambridge did the same thing for me. It challenged me in ideas of philosophy and literature, and I'm grateful for that. And so I think that there's a balance, and Lewis is playing at that. He's saying, look, not everyone, in essence, has to know everything. Not everyone has to go to all these fancy schools or whatever it may be, but instead that you should always use what God has given you to the best of your abilities. So as he notes, he says he has room for people with very little sense. In this sense, he's talking about just knowledge and the rest, but he also wants every one of us to use the sense that we have, that he knows what is there and he knows what the expectations are. So if you fall into this camp of Christians shouldn't go into higher education or they need to be careful because they're going to lose their faith, I would just like to encourage you to say, lift up those individuals, surround them, help them, guide them during those times, which is what I had. I had a group of people who loved me dearly, who surrounded me constantly through my studies, through my questions during that time, and many of which are even in this group that I'm grateful for. And so I never felt like I was unknown. I never really questioned faith in the same way that a lot of people would just assume because you become an intellectual, an academic in some form. On the other side, it's also, I can just be honest with this too. It's very easy to become haughty. It's very easy to become very full of yourself. If you believe that just letters after your name are somehow going to change everything, they're not. There's one thing to have knowledge. It's another thing to understand wisdom. Knowledge, you can know a lot of things, and I've said this before. I know a lot of well-credentialed fools, well-credentialed people with very little common sense and very little sense in general when it comes to truth and when it comes to faith. They have a lot of degrees and go to a lot of places, but they also miss out on what truly is there. So I think there's two extremes, and we have to be careful about those extremes, and I think that's what Lewis is ultimately getting at here. God is no fonder of intellectual slackers than any other slackers. And I love this. Look, if you've got a brain, God wants you to put it to use. If you are thinking of becoming a Christian, I warn you, you are embarking on something which is going to take the whole of you, brains and all. But fortunately, it works the other way around. Anyone who is honestly trying to be a Christian will soon find his intelligence being sharpened. One of the reasons why it needs not special education to be a Christian is that Christianity is an education itself. That is why an uneducated believer like Bunyan, this is Paul Bunyan, was able to write a book that has astonished the whole world, The Pilgrim's Progress. And I'll tell you this is 100% on point. I would actually say anyone who is honestly trying to be a Christian will soon find his intelligence being sharpened because Christianity is an education of itself. That's the thing that I realized more than anything when I went to school at some of these other institutions. That I had an education most people didn't have. And it wasn't just because I had a degree. It was because the very things that were foundational in my life, the cornerstones that were there, were eternal truths that long outlived any type of book that was surrounding me in that moment. And that was something that allowed me to sustain myself during those times, during those studies. Now he goes to number 2, and this is going to be a fascinating conversation. So number 2, obviously you have the prudence, the first one. Temperance is, unfortunately, one of those words that has changed its meaning. It's not usually means teetotalism. Now, for those of you who don't know what teetotalism is, this was a movement back in that time period of complete no drinking. It was associated solely with drinking and the temperance movement, as it was called. So these are the days of abolition, in essence, where you could not have, and you had all the speakeasies and the bars hidden away and things like that all over the United States and quite a bit across the UK and the rest. And so he's saying the word has been basically hijacked. And so this is what he's saying. Temperance is, unfortunately, one of those words that has changed its meaning. It not actually usually means teetotalism. But in the days when the second cardinal virtue was christened temperance, it meant nothing of the sort. Temperance referred not specially to drink, but to all pleasures. And it mean not abstaining, but going the right length and no further. That's a key component here. Temperance did not mean abstinence. It simply means knowing the limit and not going any further. Of course, it may be the duty of a particular Christian or any Christian at a particular time to abstain from strong drink, either because he is the sort of man who cannot drink at all without drinking too much, which I guarantee you know quite a few of you know quite a few people in this one, or because he is with people who are inclined to drunkenness and must not encourage them by drinking himself. I've often said that in the United States, and I'm on a college campus and the rest, that we don't live in a drinking culture. We live in a drunken culture. You drink to get drunk. It's a very different thing than actively just being somebody who drinks. And so, but the whole point is that he is abstaining for a good reason from something which he does not condemn and which he likes to see other people enjoying. So this is a very different premise than the concept of teetotalism or complete temperance across all things. So Joshua says the pursuit of higher learning, which God at the forefront, has always been an endeavor that has helped the faith, not thwarted. Absolutely. Refusing to learn more out of fear of the testing of our faith against the arguments of man should worry us more than anything, without a doubt. In fact, this is where we can be very careful when we become functional morons ourselves, functional fools, where we only know the very things we are, but we don't know how to actually share the gospel to the world or what questions they really have. And that is something we have to be very, very wary of. So this argument that he's making, in essence, usually like, look, temperance is not about teetotalism. In fact, temperance is always meant to be the concept of that you don't abstain, but you know the limits. You know where you are to go with it. Now, don't miss this. This is where he's also going. One of the marks of a certain type of bad man is that he cannot give up a thing himself without wanting everyone else to give it up. That is not the Christian way. An individual Christian may see fit to give up all sorts of things for special reasons, marriage or meat or beer or the cinema, but the moment he starts saying the things are bad in themselves or looking down his nose at other people who do not use them, he has taken the wrong turning. Now, this is an interesting thing because I do know that in our brotherhood, and by the way, this is not unusual, that there are still what have been historically called the one-sip drunk in that premise. And I really do believe well-meaning brothers. I've heard the arguments. I've seen the arguments for years and years and years. We have a whole section of our brotherhood where the idea of even type of alcohol, even within the Lord's Supper, so taking wine, for example, in Italy, they would see it as inherently sinful. And there are arguments that are made, which, by the way, come out of the teetotalism movement. Those biblical arguments come out of that era in the late 1800s, 1900s, and the rest, that prior to this, historically speaking, that was never the case. That's not what you find historically within the church, not just Church of Christ. I'm talking about church on the whole, was not the case where they viewed wine in that same way. And this argument here, and in fact, this is this argument of a certain type of bad man is the one who cannot give up a thing without wanting everyone else to give it up. It's because it almost becomes a sign of pride that I'm giving this up, and if you're not willing to give this up, then, man, you don't understand what really being a Christian is. And then it's gone so far as to go to the other side of it, where it's almost like, well, not only am I right, but you're wrong for even doing it. In fact, it's sinful. That makes me a holier individual in this manner. So I should note, just for all of you out there in case, I'll tell you, I grew up in Italy where wine was a normal staple on the table. Now, I'm not saying it was a normal staple on our table. It was, my dad worked for Harding University's overseas programs, and so same thing there. There was rules and all the rest that you could not drink, especially with students and the rest, and so we never did. I can also note that the Lord's Supper, though, every Sunday was wine. That's what was there at the time. I have no idea about any of the background of the alcoholic nature of that wine in of itself. I just know that that was part of the culture and what it is. Now, Italy is a drinking culture where it's an art form as opposed to the United States where it's a drunken culture. That's a very different thing. I can also tell you from personal experience and personal life itself, I don't drink. I never have. I've never had the inclination or the desire. I'll give you the other side of it. I have a very addictive personality, and so I worry. And so because of that, it's just never been something I've gone anywhere near. But it's a very different thing to then take my own personal experiences, my own personal life, my own personal thing, and bind it on others in a way that would make me seem or feel like I'm doing something better than what others might do. Now, just as an encouragement, especially as I noted I work on a college campus and the rest here, I find very little value, if any, to the idea of drunkenness, to the and not just drunkenness, but to drinking in general. I don't find any, not only the desire, but I don't find the inclinations to see the value of it, especially in our culture. But at the same time, I want to be fair with what I do believe Scripture teaches, which is that drunkenness is a sin, and it is something that all Christians should seek to avoid at all costs, especially with what we know can happen from these. I don't think we should miss the fact that we are, well, for lack of a better word, we are a people who could be a people of excess. And I just think we need to be careful. I think we need to be very, very weary of falling down that rabbit hole, ironically. I say that as the name here. So one great piece of mischief has been done by the modern restriction of the word temperance to the question of drink. It helps people to forget, and this is what I love, that can be just as intemperate about lots of other things. A man who makes his golf or his motor bicycle the center of his life, or a woman who devotes all her thoughts to clothes or bridge or her dog, is being just as intemperate as someone who gets drunk every evening. Now notice this. Of course, it does not show on the outside so easily. Bridge mania or golf mania do not make you fall down in the middle of the road. But God is not deceived by externals. God is not deceived by externals. So this idea of temperance, by the way, and this is where I would put this in there, and I may step on some toes here. What's the difference between being a drunkard and being so in love with your football team to where you'll sacrifice your Sundays and the rest for your football team, but you're being intemperate there just as much as you might be intemperate when it comes to drink? One is visible, and the other one, believe it or not, can be felt and seen in a lot of ways. And this argument, in essence, that he's making is temperance. Temperance, it's not just drinking. It's so much more than that. There are a lot of things that can become gods in your life that take away your attention from who God is and how you are to worship him. And in fact, they become the very thing that you end up worshiping. Then he goes into justice, which is the third one. Justice means much more than the sort of thing that goes on in law courts. It is the old name for everything we should now call fairness. It includes honesty, give and take, truthfulness, keeping promises, and all that side of life. And then he adds the fourth one. And fortitude includes both kinds of courage, the kind that faces danger as well as the kind that sticks it under pain. Guts is perhaps the nearest modern English. You will decide, of course, that you cannot practice any of the other virtues very long without bringing this one into play, fortitude. There is one further point about the virtues that ought to be noticed. There is a difference between doing some particular act, just or temperate action, and being a just or temperate man. Someone who is not a good tennis player may not and then make a good shot. May or may not have a good shot. What you mean by a good player is a man whose eye and muscle and nerves have been so trained by making innumerable good shots that they cannot be relied on. So this, in essence, he's saying this, everyone can have a good shot at the moment, but it doesn't make them a good tennis player. Instead, it's the person who can do it consistently over and over and over again, and they can be relied on as a good player, not because they simply made a good shot once. So just doing these actions, virtuous actions, once or twice, in and of themselves does not make a person just or temperate. They have a certain tone or quality which is there even when he is not playing, just as a mathematician's mind has a certain habit and outlook which is there even when he is not doing mathematics. In the same way, a man who perseveres in doing just actions gets in the end a certain quality of character. Now, it is that quality rather than the particular actions which we mean when we talk of a virtue. So, in essence, it's the very thing that the person becomes. It's not necessarily the actions themselves. It's the doing those things over and over again that changes your very character, changes the very person that you are. In fact, I could say this there are certain individuals that you just spend time with where you can tell their character has been forged through a lifetime of virtues. I didn't know if I would share this tonight, but I'll share this. We just got word a little while ago that one of our members passed, and we knew it was coming. We knew from last week. We went home to be with hospice, but I first met him when I was in school at Freed-Hardeman. He was older at the time. He had just retired and gone back to do his undergraduate and master's. I believe he was undergraduate and master's at Freed-Hardeman in Bible. He had been an elder in the church already, and yet here he was sitting across from us, quite a few years older than all of us, and he became an adopted grandfather to us all. And I love him dearly, and I still do. And the man that he was then, showing us what it meant to be a student of God's word, even in his retirement, he was wanting to better serve the church by continuing his education, by growing his faith in those ways, sitting alongside us young whippersnappers, as I remember him once calling us, and going to chapel with us. And when we would complain about chapel, and he would smile and just say, man, isn't it just wonderful to be able to begin the day worshiping God? I remember these things. And I'll tell you what was interesting was when I moved here a year and a half ago, and I turned around, and there he was, he and his wife. And they had moved here and been part of this congregation, and we were able to reconnect over this past year and a half and remember the old days back at Freed-Hardeman and the times that we had together. And we kind of co-taught a class last year on the book of Exodus together, and up until his final days, he was set up teaching class on Sundays and the rest. And even though this cancer ultimately got the best of him in this thing, I can tell you this, that he rests in the arms of Jesus tonight. And his character and his virtues and who he is permeated his very essence, permeated his life on a consistent basis. And so I'm grateful for men who have exemplified what Lewis is talking like this in my own life. And I guarantee you probably have some men or women in your own lives who have lived out in this way. I'll miss Ron in this life, but I know that in eternity we will have quite a bit of time to catch up. Ron Brewer was just a fantastic man, and I'm grateful for his character and the way that the virtues lived themselves out in his life every day. This distinction is important for the following reason. If we thought only of the particular actions, we might encourage three wrong ideas. So this is an interesting point that he goes into, and he wants to make this distinction. We might think that provided that you did the right thing, it did not matter how or why you did it, whether you did it willingly or unwillingly, sulkily or cheerfully, through fear of public opinion or for its own sake. But the truth is that right actions done for the wrong reason do not help to build the internal quality or character called virtue. And it is the quality of character that really matters. And this is what it comes down to. So just doing the actions for all the wrong reasons will not change your character. This isn't a fake it till you make it type of scenario. The reasons and why you do things matter. The second one is this. We might think that God wanted simply obedience to a set of rules, whereas he really wants people of a particular sort. This is where I go back to the idea of God is not interested in simple mental assent or outward action. He is looking for people to be transformed as a particular part of a sort of people. And number three, we might think that the virtues were necessary only for this present life. That in the other world, we could stop being just because there is nothing to quarrel about and stop being brave because there is no danger. He's basically saying the very people that God wants us to be is not just about this life. It's more than that. Our character being defined by these virtues means something more than just the right here and the right now. Now, it is quite true that there will probably be no occasion for just or courageous acts in the next world, but there will be every occasion for being the sort of people that we can become only as the result of doing such acts here. The point is not that God will refuse you admission to his eternal world if you have not got certain qualities of character. The point is that if people have not got at least the beginnings of those qualities inside them, then no possible external conditions could make a heaven for them. That is, could make them happy with the deep, strong, unshakable kind of happiness God intends for us. I'm grateful that Lewis gets to this point, and I wish we could just dive right into the next chapter, because there's so much more that he then leads off of on this very point. But I do want to note that this idea that God is not going to refuse your admission, basically, if you don't have, a set number of qualities and characteristics that you have to have, because we've all been made different, as noted before, and every one of us is unique in our own way. But his ultimate point is that these qualities, at least the beginning of these qualities, what it means to be like God, what it means to be in the image of his Son, matters. That we are doing our best to, and not because we can earn our way in any way, but to show our devotion to God, our love to God, and that we are transformed by the renewing of our mind, that becomes the major premise of what it is that we're doing with this. And I think Lewis is getting at something here, and something that we will follow into in the next time that we gather together. So that's it for tonight. As always, I'm so grateful for each and every one of you, all of those that are tuned in even right now. Grateful for your presence, for your love. If you want to pray tonight, just pray for the Brewer family. We love them deeply. So grateful for his life, and I am grateful that I can rest in the assurance that we will see him in eternity, the eternity that Lewis speaks of. I think that's going to be a wonderful thing, a wonderful reunion. And I'm grateful for each and every one of you. I spend about 20 minutes before I start each night praying for all those that might listen tonight, if you're watching after the fact or if you're just live in these moments. I just want you to know how much I'm grateful, and I do not take for granted your time and the fact that your willingness to join us and to be part of this. I am grateful for you and for what you do in your life. I love going and tracking some of you down on Facebook and seeing how you serve and what you're doing. And I love sharing in life with you in that. Until next week, know that I love you all. If I can be of service to you in any way, please reach out to me. I'm more than happy to serve you if I can. And until then, we will see you next week. I hope God blesses you in all things, and always do your best to serve all. I hope you have a wonderful week. We'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.